Hello, and welcome to my weekly podcast, broadcast from Fiddler's Green, the typical distributist podcast where I talk about culture, politics, and whatnot. Usually it's divided up between an hour of monologue and an hour of audience questions, but tonight I come to you this St. Nicholas Day completely empty-handed. I have no monologue prepared. Just to answer your guys' questions. Last night I had on a good friend of mine, Father David, and we discussed sort of the more spiritual elements of Advent. Something that I want to talk more about spirituality on this live stream, on this podcast. But the issue is that I'm supremely unqualified to talk about spiritual matters. And because of that, I'm always kind of left wondering if I'm feeding people something that's actually spiritually nourishing or just my crackpot theology, my extemporaneous beliefs on what not. And it has nothing to do with genuinely good religious teaching. So it's always good to have somebody who's a man of the cloth, who's able to give, I hesitate to say expert perspective, but a perspective that's more grounded in somebody whose his spiritual existence and his stewardship of the spiritual life of a community is part of the background of his life. He isn't coming back from an hour, like a 10-hour job computer programming to talk about whatever he thought about on his lunch break or cross-apply something that I thought I learned from G.K. Chesterton to the modern day world. So I want people to have a chance to kind of come in and ask their questions. You can use the @distributist tag if you want to catch my attention if there's no super chats. Super chats do help me organize and get through questions because otherwise I have no way to prioritize serious questions from sort of what the Franklin calls Spurg chat questions. So because of that, I appreciate any questions you have to ask me. They really do. They really do help kind of make the live stream go. Probably this will be a little bit of a shorter one, 2 hours long. I also put out some feelers on Twitter to see what people wanted me to talk about. It's funny because a lot of stuff happened this week, but nothing really new happened. Obviously, there's this huge Kanye West meltdown not meltdown, but there was this huge fiasco with Alex Jones and Kanye West. It kind of exploded the whole Kanye manic depressive cycle, where he shows up on Alex Jones's podcast wearing a ski mask and literally claiming to be an advocate for Hitler. And, it was great television, right? But for those people who thought that this Kanye West bipolar disorder eruption was going to kind of be some mass American red pilling, I think this was the end of this hope. This also was the end of Nick Fuentes' bid for his fourth or fifth chance at relevance, because after this explosion that Kanye West had on Alex Jones, this whole avenue discussion is over. The ADL, which had previously been chastised by their interactions with Elon Musk, has found themselves newly empowered. They're getting invited back into the rooms where they were previously barred from because of their poor behavior, or really poor behavior on the part of Greenblatt specifically. But now, all of a sudden, people have to pay deference to them because their worst fears about the slippery slope towards anti-Semitism are confirmed. And now we can be happy that, or unhappy, whatever your preference is on these characters, that probably Milo and Nick Fuentes, and to a lesser degree Kanye West, because I think he'll still be known as a great musician, these people's careers are probably going to be relegated to more or less obscurity for the foreseeable future. And I think that's sort of the consequence of it. And this was foreseeable. An academic agent was talking to John D about this afternoon. And there's always these Nick fans that show up and talk. Oh, well, he's naming the enemy or whatnot. He's mainstreaming radical right-wing ideas, which means that by comparison, we're seen as the sensible centrists. And, academic agent had a great response. He said, guys, where are the people directly to your left? Where are the people that are closest to what you want? And you're alienating us. We're not on board with this. So if we're not on board with this, what is the chance that you have any appeal out to outside parties, despite being sort of a cautionary tale of what happens to people who go nuts and or who try to. And the problem also is the presence of people like I don't know what Nick Fuentes' beliefs are. To be quite honest, he could be a sincere believer. He could be somebody who's just more or less a troll. But and I don't know the contents of Milo Yiannopoulos' soul either. Again, he supposedly had a conversion to Catholicism. But Milo has had a frequent track record before his conversion of being a fabulist, being somebody who hogged the spotlight and who would say anything for reactions, whether he believed them or not, and who would always kind of chase scandal. And so, there's nothing serious about this. This is people basically exploiting somebody who had a mental breakdown for clout, and that's what it was. And it's going to be more useful to our enemies than it is for any kind of reframing of the political dialogue. I think more useful for the right was the what was called the Twitter files, the Twitter dossiers, or what some people are calling Twittergate. So Elon Musk essentially dumped a huge set of documents on two journalists, Matt Taibbi and Barry Weiss, both of who have sort of mainstream creds. Barry Weiss, obviously, formerly from the New York Times, and Matt Taibbi from the Wall Street Journal. And these documents basically tell us explicitly what we already knew, that Twitter was actively trying to influence the 2020 elections, that it took really unethical, possibly illegal actions to censor a story that they should have been able to quite easily confirm was true, and that this was done under the advisement, or maybe even the direction of the central our intelligence agencies, the alphabet agencies, the CIA and the FBI. And that this was, from what it looks like, that this was some kind of standard practice. Obviously Snowden kind of blew the whistle on this type of collusion in the past, so we have no right to say that we couldn't have seen this coming. But what we have in our hands is basically, perhaps a decade of having the primary way which new ideas are circulated in our society, and through which journalists communicate with their audiences and, more importantly, with each other and develop narratives, for almost a decade that might have been directly controlled by the deep state, by the FBI. They could have been controlling any of this stuff for any amount of time. There's a case that this developed more recently, but we'll never know, because as we know, what was his name? Is it Jim Baker? Jim Baker was this. I'm gonna get this guy's name right here. It's kind of crazy when you think about this, right? This is this guy. I'll say, I won't get his first name right, but I'm pretty sure his name is Jim Baker. So Jim Baker he's an FBI coordinator director. He resigns from the FBI and then comes to Twitter to work as a full-time executive there, managing their misinformation department. And this is the guy who's basically deciding how to communicate or how to catechize people responsible for controlling engagement and narrative flow on the country's most powerful social media platform. And not only that, he stays on with Twitter. And by the time these Twitter dossiers or these Twitter documents leak to the press or are given to the press by Elon Musk, Baker has had a chance to, he basically has gotten his hands on them, he's vetted them, and he's destroyed information he doesn't want the public to see. So what we're seeing is very likely only a small fraction of what is actually going on. And I don't know. I mean, and the question, of course, is, well, what difference does it make? Hillary Clinton's question. I mean, who's gonna run with this? And it's hard to say who, right? I mean, I assume that there are some moderates out there who still care about good governance. that don't want social media just ruled by alphabet agencies. But the left isn't going to take this up. The last activist leftists that cared about separation of powers and governance basically got canceled from their institutions, along with people like Glenn Greenwald. And what we have left are tired boomers looking to be comfortable in their illusions that everything is going all right and that we're 5 years away from implementing John Lennon's Imagine, or psychotic millennial activists, mainly psychotic millennial activist women, who are absolutely starved for meaning and religion and who want a constant stream of left-wing crusades so that they don't have to seriously examine their own lives or examine the society that was created by the application of their activism to the world. And, those are the people who control the narrative. And then we have like a huge morass of people who are apathetic. Those are the people who, in the mainstay, control the flow of democracy in the present world. I mean, it's significant. It's significant in the fact that I think very few people are going to be optimistic about sort of our pretense of limited government or an independent media. Though these ideas should now be dead. These ideas of an independent media should be dead. These ideas of separation of powers should be dead. These ideas of a free marketplace of ideas should be dead. Elections are tactical guerrilla. I mean, it's kind of silly when you think about it, right? Since no side respects any rules that pertain to elections at this stage, all we're saying is that we're going to have a toss-up. I mean, because there is real power that goes up for grabs during an election, and that's not an illusion. I mean, the executive branch in particular has the ability to do enormous damage to these alphabet agencies by firing or hiring select staff members, even if they don't go full rage, like our friend Yarvin would recommend. Rage being retire all government employees, even if they don't purge the deep state. Their ability to sort of rain down problems for the deep state is enormous. And so there is actually real power that goes up for grabs in elections. The problem is that there apparently are no rules or no boundaries under which elections are conducted. No one's ever going to accept the legitimacy of an election they lost ever again. I don't know why would they, because because the fact that elections are contrived, the fact that public opinion is manufactured by media output and by get out the vote attempts and by conversations created on social media, I obviously it's being manipulated more by the left wing, but the left has its own stories about how the right is secretly manipulating people. And they're not entirely wrong, because with the exception of the very few people who think deeply about politics, most people are manipulated by the media. Most people don't have. I mean, you'd have to put enormous research into making a good decision for even a minor political issue. Just if you pick up a local ballot, you look at some controversy around water management or some controversy around the local school board, and you think to yourself, I probably could spend 3 hours learning the ins and outs of this, and that you just know that the devil's in the details, and that the blurb you're being asked to vote on is sort of a prefigure. It's not really a representative of the actual controversy that's going on for the people who actually know about it, and this is basically just a toss-up. So elections have become this, I mean, they must at this stage become this very strange thing where it's just, it reminds me of this old Super Nintendo game called like Basket Brawl. And in this game, it's like this very, very primitive Nintendo basketball game where, because the computer is so limited in its resources, you control 2 or 3 guys. But in Basket Brawl, you can actually like tackle the other player and hit them with weapons. And so, it becomes this kind of cross between a sports game and a beat-em-up game, which, it wasn't a very good game, but it was super funny in concept. And it's just like, okay, we're going to play a game like basketball that they don't, it has very formalized rules, but we're going to allow people to like slide tackle, sucker punch, and hit people with baseball bats. That's not going to become. That's not going to stay a basketball game. It's going to be very quickly become, some free for all boxing match, because basketball doesn't work like that. It doesn't even work like football, where you can kind of have lines of scrimmage and all of that. This is our society kind of disintegrating in front of us, and it is what it is. I did ask before I started this talk. I put out a tweet just asking people to give me general questions, and I noticed that there was a few questions here, and these aren't building towards any bigger thesis, so treat them with a grain of salt here. A lot of people are wondering, I think, about what are the divides on the modern right. We had another one about how to fix various different divides. I've said before that there's a number of fake divides, like paganism versus Christianity is a fake divide. The degree to which you emphasize or do not emphasize race is also, I think, a fictional divide. I think as long as you acknowledge people have the right to preserve their own ethnicities and marry who they want to and develop their own communities independently, this obsession with race is, and also if you acknowledge sort of certain controversial scientific realities that may or may not be true, that sort of disrupt our notions of how a completely equitable society can be run, even, can't even possibly be run, then, if you acknowledge those things, then this sort of obsession about, do you put the right emphasis on this topic? This is a fake debate. There's no really steelman substantive difference between these positions. It's a matter of emphasis. It's a matter of focus, and ultimately, it's not going to come to much in any meaningful political divide. And we kind of hamper ourselves while we force people who aren't interested in the topic to pass purity tests concerning that topic. And it's really immaterial. And we don't even know what's possible on these topics either. So, that's a fake divide. There was a bunch of ones that came up in this. The American versus European divide is fake. I guess it's somewhat real in a sense. It was real 10 years ago. Before Trump, the European versus American divide was real because American conservatism represented a certain constituency of the establishment. It represented the neoconservatives, which are broadly aligned with the Department of Defense, right, and the Pentagon, and maybe the Joint Chiefs of Staff if you go back far enough, right? And the Pentagon and the Department of Defense had different priorities than the State Department. Their bureaucracies were somewhat separated, although they were post-Vietnam, they had increasingly large amounts of overlap. And because of this, you could see that the Republicans represented a different ideological vision. Because the vision that the neoconservatives had was sort of this ultra-capitalist, ultra-individualist world that was organized around consumer convenience. And this was at odds. It was at odds with what generally Europeans wanted, which is, isn't really saying much because all modern European political parties are at odds with what most indigenous Europeans want, I should say. But moreover, what was the big problem in the European and American divide, before Trump, was that while the neoconservative vision was at odds with the European imagination, so to speak, it was actually massively at odds with the right-wing European imagination. In fact, it was 180 degrees pointing in the opposite direction. So you just couldn't have a consilience between, say, someone like Le Pen and the writers of National Review, or Viktor Orban and the people who wrote for the Weekly Standard or whatever. And because those people were operating in different worlds, they didn't have the same priorities. Now with Trump, that barrier has largely been abolished. Trump and the distant right that is kind of the intellectual shadow of Trump's disruptive step in 2016 comprise a mainstay of the U.S. right that is more or less in sync with what the European right wants as well. And we have ideological disagreements. We have differences in emphasis. We have differences in emphasis. But at core, there's a commonality there. And the only way, like, to contrive a huge conflict where you're on Team America or Team Europe is to resurrect a destructive divide that stopped a lot of fruitful conversations from happening and stopped a lot of interesting crossovers from coming into existence, and may have prevented an alternative community of culture developing that was fundamentally transatlantic that we need now more than ever. And so those things are all fake. And the things that I think are not fake, I mean, they're fake. The European one, again, is real, but I feel like it's fading. And if we don't do fake and gay shit, it will continue to fade and it will die by itself. It is already in the process of dying. You have, I'll bring this couple up. You have like Brittany Sellner and Martin Sellner, or I guess she was originally, her maiden name was Brittany Pettibone and Martin Sellner. And Brittany Pettibone is like your image of the upper class, old school, red Catholic American, right? And yet she kind of integrates herself into this old world conservatism very easily because there's a total consilience of worldviews and there's almost no tension. And there needs to be more steps in that direction because what we are looking for is synthesis of new ideas. And and that path can only come from going to different cultures and kind of learning what their point of view on the world is. That's why places like France and Hungary are just invaluable to the right wing at this stage. It also helps that they don't speak English. They don't speak English because I think it's important for right-wingers of all classes to develop a sort of cosmopolitan consciousness that you have a Hungarian speaking Hungarian to you, and you don't immediately assume that he's some kind of elite that's here to judge you. You see him as a fellow Christian, a fellow Westerner, perhaps, if you're of that persuasion. Somebody who values an existence in this world that isn't dictated by NGOs or Klaus Schwab or corporate understandings of what the human good is in terms of convenience and efficiency. And there's a dialogue to be had there. And even if you don't learn Hungarian, maybe you can learn what it is to think of the world like a Hungarian speaker thinks of the world. Language really does confine how we view the world. And as someone is raised with a different mother tongue and similar values to you, that's a huge resource. And it's a resource that right-wingers just have not availed themselves, to for the last like 4 or 5 decades, since the end of World War II almost, since the 60s at least. And it's a huge tragedy, especially because when you kind of honestly look at these countries, with the exception of Germany and maybe England, these countries have a deep soul to them that can be described as nothing other than conservative. France would be the primary example, incorrectly labeled for decades by the neocon right as being, well, revolutionary. Have they even talked to Frenchmen? I mean, I know there was a French Revolution in the late 18th century, and continuous French revolutions throughout the 19th century of declining magnitude, certainly. And so there's a certain mythology of the French Revolution that's built into the Francophonic imagination. Has anyone of these people who were calling the French, radicals, have they ever talked to Frenchmen? They are incredibly conservative people. Their ethnocentrism is remarkable, and I admire them for that. And that's sort of a brilliant, the strident and unapologetic ethnocentrism of a Frenchman or a French woman, for that matter, is something that's it's genuinely refreshing. It's so different, and it's obviously not that different because this has been a thing for centuries. But it's such a marked counter note to sort of the bounds of culture and discourse that we experience in our everyday lives that it really is quite refreshing. So I would say that is a conflict that is real, but is in decline, as the Europe versus American conflict. And then there are what I consider like the real conflicts. The real conflicts that are like demographic conflicts that spawn a lot of problems are the urban versus rural divide, which, like I said, I piss people off talking about this because I'm absolutely a blue stater, and I've lived most of my lives in either in urban areas or in sort of the penumbra or the shadow around urban areas, in the shadows of Seattle, as the band Marcy Playground would put it. And this creates a divide because the red America feels like it's been betrayed by the cities, and it has. And red Americans rightly believe that they are better people than blue staters, and indeed they are. And they're better morally, right? But the problem is that there's just sort of a power physics involved in this equation. There's a certain kind of way that blue staters have been trained to think and act and perceive problems that red staters have not been trained to think and act. And there's a certain, with the exception of people like the good old boys, who I think have taken sort of steps autodidactically to educate themselves to take red state ideas and think about them like blue staters would think about them. But there's this divide there, and there's also this divide in terms of your cultural exposure to different things that the internet can somewhat overcome. And that is the fact that the blue states always encounter the ideas faster than you. And they encounter them in the real world. They internalize the ideas faster because they're closer to the action. And these things, these barriers are sort of temperamentally unsurmountable. And they're temperamentally unsurmountable, and the only way they can be dealt with or resolved is for the two sides to be synthesized. There needs to be a common language by which the city mouse and the country mouse can get together and be friends. The opposition between the two of them is one of them. The friction between the opposition of the red areas and the blue areas is one of the things that gives progressivism its necessary political power, its energy. It feeds off of that stuff. With a American macroculture or an American alternative culture or an American counterculture that bridges the gap between those two spaces so that people feel comfortable going back and forth, that's a portal to a new world. I mean, I use this example all the time. People who've watched my channel have been aware of this. Red staters feel uncomfortable walking into a place like New York. So do people from Eritrea or Somalia, or for people like Russia. But the Russian guy or the Somalian can walk into New York and go, okay, so where are my kind of people in New York? Where are the people who are my political allies, who see themselves as my countrymen, my comrade? Sounds a little bit leading, but you get the idea. Where can I find my people? Where can I go to a store and kind of be seen as somebody who's a fellow traveler in a strange land? It's really odd, but it's easier to do that as a foreign national in a city like LA or New York or San Francisco, much less so San Francisco because of how it's organized. It's much easier to do that as a foreign national than it is as a red stater. Why is that? Shouldn't there be a way to sort of build a network as a well-educated red stater? I mean, I don't say if you're somebody who's a trucker who has really no business to be in New York and has zero ability to communicate with ideas that are talked about there, maybe that is necessarily not going to be a good fit for you, and that's fine. You could be a better person than every person in New York and be like that. But let's say you're a well-educated red stater. Who are your people in New York? Crickets, right? Crickets. You don't have people in New York, or maybe you do, but those are the sort of burgeoning, right-wing sort of counterculture that occurs in some areas in New York that's been written about in some articles here or there in places like the New Yorker or what was it, Vanity Fair. This is so it's something that we need to kind of think about synthesizing, and it comes down to having a common language. It's kind of funny that you mentioned this because answering this question from Twitter, it brings to mind another horrible talk. Richard Hanania has just been batting. Like, oh my God, how the mighty have fallen. He's kind of retreated to this think tankism, right? And he had this person on it. So obviously Richard Hanania, he did a series of great blog posts in 2021, absolute grand slams about the nature of left versus right, about some inconvenient truths that have occurred inside our study of biology. He came up with the great phrase, female tears win in the marketplace of ideas. And he had some great insights about the nature of civil rights law. He basically built on the back of The Age of Entitlement, the Christopher Cantwell book. Or is it Caldwell? I think it's Caldwell, Christopher Caldwell's book. And I can never, there's too many people who have similar names, guys. This is so hard to keep these people straight on the live stream where you don't have notes prepared in advance, right? Anyway, so another one of his ideas, and this was actually an idea that I offended for a little bit, is that progressives win more because progressives care more. They do more activism. Their lives revolve more around politics. And the thing is that there's a kernel of truth to Hanani's observation that progressives care more. Progressives have more activists, and progressives define themselves religiously in terms of politics. And they're taught to think about their political actions in a different way than most red staters are, who basically want to hold their political entity as something that occurs in the background. You know, I'm going to go to this election rally come election time, and then for the rest of the year, I'm going to grill for 4th of July, and I'm going to have my church picnic. I mean, you can call them the grill Americans, right? But that's a healthy thing, right? And you know, people do. And the thing is that in a sense, when you celebrate 4th of July and your church picnic or Christmas, to red Americans, that's a religious holiday. That's how they get their fulfillment. Progressives, for the most part, anyone past the sort of Gen X cutoff, these people, every single social event is essentially a religious event for the religion of progressivism. It's their lives. The elite activist class in progressives lives and breathes their politics as a religion, and because of that, they care more. And there's a certain amount of bio-Leninism in this process, the Spandrel's thesis, that a lot of these people, for a lot of these people, not all of them obviously, the whole PMC is kind of leaning progressive. But for the people who really care, for the people who live and breathe this as activists, oftentimes they're the very people that if progressivism fell through for them, they would have absolutely nothing. And because of that, their dedication is broadly inversely proportional to the healthiness of their lives. And I know I'm a person who's dedicated their own life to politics, or at least most of my spare time that's not consumed by family and my non-political job. I sympathize with that a little bit, right? And so the progressives care more. Now, I think the kicker, though, is that this is a structural problem. And the other thing, too, is that, progressives have more high IQ people. Now, is the average progressive smarter than the average conservative? No, they're more or less equal. They're more or less equal, and maybe even conservatives have a little bit of an advantage. But this is also a misnomer as well, because the progressives have sort of the high and the lows, and the conservatives have the middle. And politics is not a game that's played by the middle. It's played by the highs or the close to the highs. And so when you get into sort of the progressive managerial class, and in particular the people who dedicate themselves to activism in that class, we're talking about a population, whose high IQ participants are overwhelmingly on the left because that's what they've been trained to do. Now, both of those observations have a kernel of truth to them. And but you see Richard Hanania just sort of falling into these intellectual traps that he should know better than to fall into. Right? This last week he had a guest on his podcast. I can't remember who the guest's name was. Maybe I can pull it up here. Probably shouldn't be doing this live. Yeah, probably shouldn't be doing this live. His guest was Aaron Sabarium. Yeah. And so they take these theses. Obviously, they're anti-woke people. They think progressivism has a lot of problems, but these people are all ex-progressives themselves, and there's nothing wrong with that. Technically speaking, I'm an ex-progressive myself, although I probably dabbled a little bit too much in libertarianism for me to ever be completely pure in that regards. My height of my progressivism was kind of being a Barack Obama shitlib for 4 years or whatever. And that's cool. And I want to be very, very charitable to people who are apostates from the progressive religion. But oftentimes these bad ideas get carried over, and there's a very fine line. It has to do with the sort of high elf, the dark elves versus the hobbits. This is Garvin's big stumbling block essay. They all stumble on these very, very fine distinctions that need to be made. And you can see it in this conversation between Aaron Sabarium and Richard Hanania. So Aaron Sabarium has this idea that what the right really needs to do is we need to be technocrats, but from the right. And the right's big problem is that the wokies are crazy. But everyone who's pointing out that the wokies are crazy are themselves like nuts themselves. There are all these people talking about Pizzagate and how the Balenciaga or whatever, how the Balenciaga are all pedophiles. And for every good idea they have a kooky conspiracy theory on the side about how vaccines might not be safe or whatnot. And this spoils what could ordinarily be a very effective move against the left wing. As Richard Hanania points out, look, affirmative action's so unpopular, guys. It's so unpopular that if we just dumped all this other ideological stuff, the larger critiques of liberalism, and created campaigns around opposing affirmative action, that would be dynamite politically. We could win elections on that. Or we would just dump the pro-life stuff. If we dump the religious people, if we dump the radicals, the people who make us look bad, we could be a right-wing technocratic solution. And Sabarium's example was, well, I don't really care about crazy stuff on universities. I don't care how much they talk about how gender doesn't exist on universities. But when they start giving pride of place to African Americans to get medical care, that's where we cross the line. So, this is this methodological thing that we can head these things off. The way we should be doing this is we should just cede the moral, philosophical, and ideological ground 100% to the left when it comes to the universities, and then we should swoop in at the last minute. The police sirens go up, and we pull them over, and we hand them a ticket at the very moment when they go completely nuts, and they start using racial categories to prioritize and triage medical care, which is illegal. But the reason why they don't suffer any consequences is by the time you have that little moment of perpetration against the secret liberal principles, these ideas have completely saturated the medical establishment. They don't do racial triage unless 100% of the managerial class above them is on board, because otherwise they'd be landed with a big fat lawsuit or they'd be fired. And so you have this absolutely insane perspective. And of course, Eric Sabarium has another great idea. He says, well, why isn't there Elizabeth Warren? It's because right-wingers are stupid. And so they need us to be think tank right-wingers, not be stupid. And that's how we can get, conservative Elizabeth Warren. No. If you look at Elizabeth Warren and you think, well, Elizabeth Warren is just a high IQ person who decided to become progressive, you completely misunderstood or misunderstood what Elizabeth Warren actually is. Elizabeth Warren isn't a high IQ person who is contemplating and ruminating about the truth of the universe and then came to the understanding that progressivism was true. I mean, she is a high IQ person, although I don't think she's as smart as she thinks she is. She's obviously smarter than the average person and smarter than a lot of right-wingers. But Elizabeth Warren is 100% a construction of the Ivy League university system. You cannot explain her existence without it. She's like a jelly that fills the mold of whatever the university is talking about. So, in the early days, she was a left-wing activist of the Bill Clinton variety. And then towards the 2000s, when Barbara Ehrenreich was writing her smash bestseller, nickel and dime, all of a sudden Elizabeth Warren became like this person writing about income discrimination and the two-income trap, which by modern standards sounds outright right-wing. And then, when things became more racial, she became a woke activist and a women's activist. And at first she was for safe, legal, and rare. And then, 10 years later, she's saying that even having Catholic organizations giving women the choice to not abort is a violation of women's rights. This woman, and somewhere in there, she went from being white to Native American to white again. This person completely is a function of the academy and then the unelected government that feeds from the academy. And so you have like these Richard Hanania thinking like they can reverse engineer this. You can't have Elizabeth Warren without Harvard. You can't have Elizabeth Warren without Harvard and the deep state or the bureaucracy of the deep state, backwashing each other's foramies, basically. Larry Summers goes from being president of Harvard to being part of the Obama administration to being, an academic again, and it's just seamless. And so does Elizabeth Warren. This doesn't exist for the right wing, and it's impossible to think that you can do technocracy in the same way. What are you going to be recommending? What technocracy is the idea that you're going to be selling the opinions of an oligarchy or an academia to the polis, to the government. But there is currently no alternative academy that can present itself as experts. That doesn't exist yet. And so all Richard Hanania and these people are doing is convincing themselves that they have the ability to reverse a machine that does not go in reverse, period. And it's sort of the Adam and Sitch mistake at a higher IQ level, I guess. But it's embarrassing. And I feel like this is such a problem. Because the red staters have it right. The red staters have it right when they understand that you need to make a total break with these institutions and a total break with our moral standards. Otherwise, you'll get absolutely nowhere. And that there's no reason to compete with people for who can produce a better Elizabeth Warren. That is not a game that we should be playing. But they're wrong to think that they can make a complete break or that they can make a meaningful break without having allies in the urban classes and in the elite castes. Because without that, no break is possible. Because no society is possible without heads, without people that can communicate to other cultures. You're trying to play an older technology against a newer one. So as always, I think this is a real difference in the right. This is a real conflict in the right. Because of the fact that the distinction is so small, it's so narrow, that it's very easy to fall into sort of this condescending self-assuredness like Richard Hanania. And at the same time, it's very, very tempting to also kind of just believe that, red staters, apropos of no other elite support, are going to create the Benedict option and somehow be insulated from, or even worse, that they can wage a civil war against the cities. And this is where you get the really wacky Kurt Doolittle stuff about, stories about how you can cut the cities off of supplies because all the supplies come from red states. I mean, these takes are delusional. These takes are delusional because it's like, oh, well, we can just like flip a power switch and all of a sudden all of New York just starves because that's what they do. They just sit there and starve when the lights go out. There's no political mobilization. They don't call in favors. There aren't way more of them than they are of you. And your ownership of these resources and these choke points in the supply chain are totally dependent on them not actively trying to move you off of those choke points, which they absolutely will the second you try to pull that on them. So this has never historically happened. Short of circumstances that we haven't seen yet, where there's just been a mass unorganized uprising of the rural people to choke off the cities. This does not happen historically. And elements of the rural areas can be brought into a ruling coalition and can be an important part of that and can give them energy. But these disorganized rebellions, it'll just happen, bro, because we've got this special red state quality, is that this is not how history works, I'm afraid. And so we are stuck with each other. We are stuck having to come to a synthesis, not going to Richard Hanania, let's build a right-wing version of Elizabeth Warren, and neither going down the based Civil War 2.0 guys' perspectives. These perspectives have to be synthesized, and this is going to be and they're real conflicts, and because they're real conflicts, I don't have the solutions in detail right now. A few other questions for me were activities that could bridge the red-blue divides. One said video games. Video games, but video games are worthless, and so is social media. Video games and social media, they have their benefits, but they're also drugs. And so, what you're doing is, when you look at video games, you should think of yourself looking at a bottle of wine if you were like Native American in the 19th century. And sure, the French can have this very, very fancy wine culture where they can drink three glasses of wine in the evening, wake up and go to work and be productive the next day, and then not become alcoholics. But we're not at that stage culturally or perhaps even biologically with video games or with social media. So we have to treat these things with extreme amounts of caution. These are addictive drugs that have secondary benefits that might be brought into a larger culture but we could train ourselves to use them. But we should go into using them under the assumption that we can't necessarily train ourselves to use them. And we need to respect them as such in that capacity. So there's that. And I've always thought that music would be sort of a portal to this. American music is a huge part of our experience as North Americans. It also kind of, oddly enough, it's the one thing that strongly links African Americans and European Americans together in a common American experience. And it's something that seems to be kind of, folk music in particular seems to be something that's going out of fashion in blues spheres. They can't hold it anymore comfortably. Embracing that perspective and trying to make that a core part of a political identity seems to be something that, if it's not a possibility yet, it's something that could become a possibility in the future. The other thing that, maybe I'll sort of wind this down because I do want to make this an Ask Me Anything, not a disorganized monologue. I guess I already have made it a disorganized monologue. Another thing people ask me about, another huge barrier we have, is the generational divide. And it's clear that previously the generational divide has been boomers and millennials, or boomers and Xers versus millennials and younger millennials. Or you could say status quotarian generations, like the boomers, who are actually status quo, and then the Xers, who are kind of pacifists. They don't like believing that there is some huge conflict on the horizon or there's some huge crisis, because it's uncomfortable and it makes their sort of Daria-esque, let the world go by, nothing really matters perspective. It sort of shows the lie to that. So previously, the generational divide has been boomers versus non-boomers, or boomers versus millennials. And I'm not so sure what the conversation is right now. Millennials need to keep on working on the boomers. And in particular, I think they need to get the boomers to think about their legacy. Because we're really at that stage. Boomers as political true boomers as political actors. This is a thing that's kind of going by the wayside at this stage. These people are entering their 70s, or they're in their 60s. The boomers are kind of a waning active political force. They're considering, really, I'm not trying to be grim about this, they're considering their last political actions on this earth. And our role is to make them understand that their last political action on this earth should not be, let's throw another $1 million at trying to make John Lennon's Imagine a reality. That is a fiction. That is not how reality works. There's not going to be some merging of all ethnicities into one homogenated humanity. That demographically can't happen. There could be multicultural communities, and multi-ethnic communities will have to be a reality of even right-wing communities going forward. This has to be a place for people to occupy, and a reality for them to peacefully coexist in right-wing, or there probably will not be left-wing communities in the future, but that will have to be a reality because of the fact that the world is globalized, even though it will not be homogenized. But this idea that the 60s had of all barriers being brought down, it's just not going to happen. Or to the extent it does happen, it's going to be in the form of the drug-addled pod person, the completely deracinated, depressed consumer who just plays video games, takes drugs, consumes product until he finally gets slid into a MAID program, either because of a terminal illness due to supreme lack of health, or because he's depressed, and because apparently Western governments are killing people off at ripe young ages of 37 because they're depressed. And that's a thing now, apparently. The slippery slope isn't real, but that's a thing. So that's what needs to be communicated to the boomers. To the Zoomers, it's a little bit harder because, I understand this. The true digital natives are upon us. The people that have no active memory of 9/11, the people who have no understanding of an internet that existed before social media, and really the cutoff is not internet versus pre-internet, it's social media versus pre-social media, because social media is where the internet's poison really took its true and final form. And the social media revolution is really what's bringing our own society to its knees, absolutely, in the present era. And the response here, the dialectic here is harder because Zoomers haven't really found themselves yet. Millennials, in my impression, are a much more politicized generation than the Zoomers are. Because, and I think they're also more, this is not disputable actually, they are a much more progressive generation. But I don't think there will ever be a generation that is more progressive than the millennials. Because right about now, millennial women are starting to hit some of what the pickup artist community call the walls, or the wall, if you prefer the singular. They're hitting sort of certain life barriers that make the people who are not able to get husbands and families, they're going to start getting much more depressed, much more shrill, and much more political, and not in a way that appeals to young people at all. And this, I think, is going to be a huge object lesson for Zoomers. And this is an object lesson that I hope is going to instruct them to think about things radically differently. So right now, the conversation between Zoomers and millennials, to the extent it exists, is that millennial, well, I don't even know what it is for. I mean, I guess between millennials and and Zoomers on the progressive end, the conversation is really, hey kids, why don't you get addicted to the drugs I'm addicted to, whether it's transgenderism and or left-wing political activism. And I really do mean that, because left-wing political activism it's really a social media sport. It does not exist outside of social media. It's not an intellectual affair. It's how can I pose myself as the perfect activist, pardon me, and how can I get clout because of that? And how can I be the perfect TikTok activist? The conversation between progressive millennials and Zoomer millennials, progressive millennials and progressive Zoomers, is really how do we get the kids, how do we get the kids hooked on our particular drug of choice, whether it's transgenderism, indolence, deracination, the Reddit brain, or performative politics. And let's not have them ask questions ever. The conversation between millennials and right-wing millennials and right-wing Zoomers is much more complicated. First of all, most of the questions Zoomers have towards millennials is, A, how did you guys fuck things up so much? Guilty as charged. we try to blame the boomers in turn, but it is to a large degree my generation's fault. And the second thing is how do we win, or can we even win in a meaningful way? I guess we can lose less. Anyone can lose less than we've currently lost. And how, and also what is sort of like, what's the guiding force for the future going to be? And what should Zoomers do? My advice for Zoomers has always been, stay in this world, stay grounded to reality. That's my advice for Zoomers. Always be building, always be developing yourself. Make sure that your hobbies and your fun times actually create something tangible in yourself or in the real world. You can point to and say, I did that, I built that. Have real friends. The difference between reality and the internet is not symmetrical. The more things are grounded to reality, the more right-wing they get, because the more investment they require. The more, it's like Conquest's third law. The more you care about things, the more you actually value things, the more conservative or right-wing you're going to be concerning them. The more deracinated and detached you get, the more you get into that Reddit space, the Reddit brain, so to speak, the more you're going to be left-wing. And in many ways, the left-wing brain has reached its apotheosis in the Reddit brain, and that's what you see in things like the new chatbot. There's this new, somewhat scary AI that does very convincing, has a very convincing conversational tone, and is able to create AI art and look up pieces of computer code, and it's really scared a lot of people. It hasn't really impressed me yet, but I guess an AI that will impress me is on the horizon, maybe. Who knows? But what's more kind of interesting about it is that you can ask it political questions and you can kind of stump it. And you can't stump it, but it'll give you shitlib answers. The classic example is if you ask it, do men commit more crime than women? It'll give you a straightforward answer. Of course they do. And if you ask it, well, do African Americans commit more crime than Asian Americans? It will say, well, probably not. No, they don't. Well, they kind of do, but really, no, they don't. The way that like a progressive does, they duck around the question, they reframe. And so you don't get a straightforward answer. And so you put this AI through the sort of the 8 values tests, or the political compass test, or the political test, because you can do that now. And you'll realize that this bot has been thoroughly catechized. Either it has been catechized because it's been taught to not be, conservative or right-wing at all, because they literally trained it to be such. Or it's been catechized because it has 0 values that don't pertain to some kind of optimization chart or to some numbers or some figment of virtual reality. It has 0 skin in the game. So where does it go on the political spectrum? Well, it goes, on the compass that has like the left wing the left wing versus right wing, authoritarian versus libertarian. Well, it goes to the Vosh quadrant, right? Complete de-investment from anything real, complete Coomer brain, complete Reddit brain. It's got no investment. And the disembodied consciousness, the deracinated brain, goes towards Vosh. I think it was catechized to be more shit-libby, but there's also a certain dimension to which all non-physical beings, or all beings that have no real investment in an outcome of this world, become shitlibs naturally, because why wouldn't they be? That's just sort of the natural entropic state. I'm not giving a shit about anything. And the less you give a shit about things, and the more you try to optimize for social media likes, the more you'll end up going in that direction. All right, well, those are my advice to Zoomers. I guess that's not very good advice. You'll have to put more of a point on it if you want to get more in-depth answers. If I were a Zoomer right now, though, I would just... how hard would it be? I notice this about Zoomers. They don't throw parties. Like, millennials are the last generation. And maybe it's just older millennials. But millennials were the last generation that threw parties. I actually was somebody back in the day that could throw a pretty good party, to be honest. I was pretty friendly and outgoing, and I could put together a pretty good party, all things considered. And it doesn't seem like, do Zoomers still do that? It doesn't seem like maybe COVID killed this practice off, but wouldn't that be fun to try? What if, for instance, parties were something that only right-wing Zoomers actually did. And like make them classy, right? I'm not talking about like parties where people smoke pot and fall down drunk. I'm talking about parties where people dress up, actually have cocktails, have good conversations, meet people that are genuinely interesting that they would want to be friends with outside of that party, and come away with memorable experiences and have memorable evenings. That's something that all other generations have had before you. What if that was the hallmark of the right-wing Zoomer? Was the hallmark of the left-wing millennial is Reddit, and the hallmark of the right-wing millennial is 4chan. Although I don't never use 4chan in my life. What if the hallmark of left-wing versus right-wing Zoomer was, okay, well, left-wing Zoomers have transition surgeries and hormone blockers, and right-wing Zoomers have parties and have social engagements that you actually need to put effort into dressing up for, and that aren't just excuses to abuse substances. That would be something that I think would be very, very productive. But that's just a thought anyway. All right, guys, because this is a question and answer stream, the rest of the stream will be dedicated to question and answers. Surprise, surprise. All right, so again, I'm going to ignore the questions tab. I'm going to more or less just run this from the donations tab. Okay. All right, so let's just do the first question here. Oro's post for $10 USA. Oro says, I just did a stream on the evils of weed. What should society's reaction be to the clear and present dangers of marijuana? He used weed again, but I'll say marijuana. Why is it that the right seems so tame to a clearly evil drug? How will society evolve with it being so accepted? I recommend the book Tell Your Children by Alex Berenson on the subject. Yeah, I mean, weed, marijuana is an interesting topic because to most people, it's not super dangerous. And this is a big caveat, right? Because to most people, it's like a less powerful alcohol. And it has a different narcotic effect. But two things. First of all, the culture around habitual marijuana use is absolutely poisonous. It encourages laziness in men. It encourages bad behavior in men and indolence. And that's like the worst thing you could be doing with your 20s is getting yourself really, really resigned to being lazy and playing video games. And so the culture is absolutely poisonous. The second, and I don't know if this is the dangers that Oro's post discussed on his treatment of marijuana. The second real danger, and that is, you could say it's a gateway drug, but mostly it's not. Or I guess it is to everyone who, I guess it is for some people. And some people have addictive personalities, and they go on to heavier stuff, obviously. But the real horror stories I've heard around marijuana have been it triggering psychotic episodes in people. In particular, if you're prone to things like schizophrenia or bipolar disorder. The TLC oil, the active ingredient in marijuana is really dangerous. The paranoid episodes it can bring about, it can take something that's sort of a nascent and dormant element in your psychology, and it can bring it forward really violently. And a lot of people, they take this stuff, especially like the synthetic varieties of marijuana. They take this stuff and it just destroys them. Not because the drug destroys them, but because it triggers a psychotic episode. And psychotic episodes are such that once you have one of them, like anxiety attacks, right? I had problems with anxiety. It wasn't triggered by marijuana. But once you have your first anxiety attack, they happen frequently, right? Afterwards, your body gets used to reacting in a psychotic way, and it takes you years to train yourself out of it. And I think anxiety attacks have more to do with dopamine addiction and stimulation addiction, and what I call the depression dopamine cycle, that is actually probably brought about more by the internet than by marijuana. But marijuana has a huge problem, and I'm not a medical expert by any means, but in my own life, I have seen people who are genetically predisposed to bipolar disorder and to schizophrenia having that psychosis triggered by, well, really synthetic use of the active ingredient, the TSO oil. And it's horrific. So with all of these things, like, the problem is that for a lot of people, some people can take heroin and they can have no problem with it. Like, I've known people, like, they've taken heroin once and it's like, oh, that's a fun experience. And it will be like Voltaire with sodomy, once a philosopher, twice a sodomite, once a philosopher, twice a heroin junkie, but they're the philosopher and they go and they never do it again. There are people who are like that, and they're very rare with heroin. And for marijuana use, it's much more common. You can take it, you can just be like, oh, well, that was fun, I'll never do it again. Like me, like you use it several times, you never use it again. But for a not insignificant number of people, this triggers the worst aspects of either their personality defects or their genuine mental disorders. And it can destroy people's lives mostly because of the latter. But you need to be very careful with these drugs. And society has no reason to encourage the use of this substance, especially since the idiotic culture that's emerged from marijuana use is so absolutely stupid. We've gone from, like, Jerry Garcia in the 60s to, the stoner comedies of the 2000s. That's the last productive thing that marijuana culture has ever done. It will certainly be the last, because once it was legalized, pot had ceased making anything that was ever interesting ever again. Ben Gaines for $10 USA. Sorry if this is a little bit close to the third rail, but how do you feel about E. Michael Jones? I heard you mention him in passing a few times, but never anything more than that. I've read a few of his books now and thought they were very good, if not rage-inducing because of the documented depravity. He wrote, didn't he write Libido Dominandi? I wrote a little bit of that, right? Was he the one who wrote Slaughter of Cities? I don't know. I mean, he writes a lot about the third rail, the dreaded JQ, and I've been less interested in that. But he's been one of the early documenters. I mean, really, everyone who's calling out pornography culture, and he was one of the early people who got on board with that, and he was also one person. And I'm surprised that he doesn't talk about this more. I'm looking through his books now, guys. This is what you get. Yeah, he did write the Slaughter of Cities. He's also, so the two things I would say that I think were really critical about E. Michael Jones, and I really am not a person who thinks that that third rail is very productive or useful, or it causes a lot of conflict, and you don't want to be. In the dire straits that we're in, we don't want to start you never want to create ethnic conflict ever, but especially in the dire straits when we're in, you don't want to start drawing knives and inventing like racial conflicts with people who would ordinarily be neutrally disposed to you. Enemies are expensive, especially enemies that are as thorough with attacking people they perceive to be enemies and are capable of attacking them quite well. But E. Michael Jones's contributions were sort of the deracination of the American city, the clearing out of Catholic, or mostly Catholic ethnic enclaves inside modern American cities, and having them all moved out to the suburbs, where they were subsequently deracinated and convinced to be quote unquote white. By white, we just mean deracinated European culture. But they left behind much richer traditions and much more engaged spiritual practices to basically go and be consumers in the exurbs. And it's a tragedy of culture. That and his work with porn will mark him as being, I like to think of E. Michael Jones as being a person who's logged on early to these revelations, because early critics of porn have focused on two dimensions. And the two dimensions that they focused on were sort of the Christian immorality of it all, and then sort of its implicit misogyny. And the implicit misogyny is really more from the left. But E. Michael Jones highlighted an element of pornography that I think was de-emphasized by those two perspectives. And unrightfully, obviously the feminists wouldn't emphasize this perspective, which was that pornography weakens you. It takes an instinct that should be sort of honed and released only in specific circumstances. And it takes that instinct and it turns it into a hunger that needs to be fed, and the feeding of which makes you worse. I mean, it really makes you worse at doing the non-simulation of that act, and it makes you less likely to pursue women, and it makes you less focused on it makes you less vital, and it gives you weird addictions, and it also. It has sort of this Slaneshi element to it where half of what you're reacting to when you react to porn is adrenaline, because when you pair adrenaline with dopamine, there's this insane reaction, right? That's what makes, initial exposure to sex, period, so enthralling, right? But with pornography, the adrenaline could only be obtained upon your first exposure to some given new thing, which is why porn addictions become more and more and more depraved as they go on to more and more and more extremes. And so the end result of porn addiction are people that have addictions to things that are absolutely degenerate or destructive or sometimes even violent. The feminists were not wrong to point that out in the 70s. Dworkin she had mental problems of her own. She had delusions of her own. But one of her delusions was certainly not that pornography has this dimension that entices one towards violent appreciation of subjects. And it's only through sort of the demasculinization of the American male that has headed off this tendency towards which ordinarily would have created a rape crisis, in my opinion. Porn matched with sort of the decreasing American testosterone. These have kind of kept each other in check, I think. And also, the fact that the violent urges have been plugged back into porn. But all that is to say that the destructive impulses have been made no less destructive, but have been turned inwards. So I think E. Michael Jones has highlighted that the porn's enervating dimension, the fact that it can be used as a weapon against you, and that was a missing component to the anti-porn critique, and I give him credit for that, right? Even though I think that his focus on our friends of a non-Christian and non-Islamic monotheistic persuasion is a little bit overstated and not particularly helpful, in my opinion. Not to say that there aren't bad actors or groups of bad actors. There most certainly are. Just look to Greenblatt, and you can see one of them in action. And people like Epstein were not acting alone, obviously. So be careful of that, right? But don't make enemies of people who'd ordinarily be friends. And I can vouch for the fact that there are people who they don't want to be your friends, but they want to be your co-belligerents. And they have, that community does not want to be deracinated. They don't want to be forced into pods. They don't want to have their religion destroyed. And they might have a grudge, but their self-interests will cause them to put that grudge away. And there can be useful alliances made on that front. That's all I'll say about it. Hi, Dave. This is Ben White. Ben White for $10 USA. Hi, Dave. Thank you for the stream yesterday. I decided to get back into the young adult communities in nearby parishes. I can't do my spiritual life alone. What are your criteria to know if the normie guys or girls you meet are good for your spiritual health? I assume it's different for each sex. I mean, what's good for your spiritual health is largely what you do with them, right? Right? This is the great thing about religion, is that it's embodied. And this is, what is that heresy? I always forget. Is it Marcionism? Oh, there's this ancient Christian heresy. It's from like the 6th or 7th century. Or no, it's that earlier, that 5th or 6th century. And there's this early heresy that said that because the sacraments were transmitted to you through the priest, the sacraments were in fact an extension of the priest's righteousness or the priest's state of being in a state of grace. And because of that, sacraments distributed by a non-righteous priest were sort of not valid. This is, I'm not going to say it's absolutely false, but I'll say this, I believe it to be absolutely false, because Christian thinker after Christian thinker, be they Orthodox or Protestant or Catholic, have rejected this notion in its strong form again and again and again and again. And maybe maybe you're a Protestant and you believe that we're only saved by faith alone or whatever, right? But the thing is that regardless of whether you're Protestant or not, you have a proper anthropological understanding of the human being, right? And the human being builds his faith through action and through practice and through actually doing the thing. So it does not matter if the person you're sitting next to in your youth group is a total hypocrite who's just here to try to lay the game down on the future trad wives or whatever, try to spin plates where you shouldn't be spinning plates, so to speak. It doesn't matter if they're the worst hypocrite. If they encourage you to say a decade of the rosary or to go to confession, that is spiritually healthy. And is it as spiritually healthy as if you were sitting next, if you were doing the same with a living saint, with we don't believe in reincarnation, but with our age's equivalent of Saint Francis of Assisi, would it be as good as that? I can't say. But the mainstay of the spiritual experience is in the action. Find a youth group where that does the things that you want to do more. Prayer. I think adoration is great. If you're in an urban area, youth adorations can be really good, and they usually have times afterwards where you can meet people. I used to do a lot of charity work for parishes. I ran out of time. With I regret some of the time went to blogging, which is probably not good for my soul, but most of it just went to long distance relationship, and then after that, family life, right? But charity work is also really good. And it also gives you a new view of America too. I mean, America is a very degraded place, and working at a food distribution center gives you an angle into that. And you need to see people for where they are and understand the world that you actually live in. And I don't know. As for each sex, I don't know. I mean, when you do adoration, you're going to be praying probably with a mixed sex group. Obviously, again, we're human beings. We know that men and women aren't the same, so don't treat them the same. And I don't know. I can't. I've been off the top of my head. I can't really think of sort of. I mean, there is something to be said for men's groups. I think there's something to be said for men's groups, and having a mixed gender prayer group isn't always, especially when you're sort of bearing your soul. That can be sometimes not very helpful. But besides that, there are very few things that really need to be only one sex, I guess. If you're looking to have a real heart-to-heart, for my own purposes, I really don't like... I mean, my wife accepted I don't like bearing my soul to the opposite sex. It feels really uncomfortable and strange and borderline inappropriate. Obviously, as a married man, it's inappropriate, but it felt inappropriate before I was married or even met my wife. So hopefully that helps. Thanks, Ben White, for the super chat. Shipwrecked on Plutonia. That sounds like a Doom sequel that I remember from the late 90s. Hi, Dave. I finally caught one of these live streams. Do you plan to expand on your Sildings event talk, specifically the contradiction between left-wing hopes and the end of cheap and abundant energy? It seems like a great topic. I have a few essays in the works. That's not one of them. I kind of felt we'll see. We'll see what happens. I get the sense that the left is going to have a hard time rebuilding itself post-COVID. That's just my sense. And I'm not saying like the left is going to, like, in some sense, Niccolo Soldo is absolutely right. We are entering turbo America. American hard power has grown extensively at the very time when its soft power seems to be draining away. The believability of its narrative is in the toilet. But this could mean that the left is going to have a hard time reconstituting itself. Now, if we have an energy crisis, the hard power of America could precipitously decline, in which case the entire left-wing project could hit a wall. But what I imagine is going to happen is that the left-wing political project is going to grow to be a mile wide and an inch deep. And it behooves the right wing to do the exact opposite, to be small, concentrated, and very, very deep, very, very invested. Right-wingers should be known as the people who actually believe whatever, and this is why I think neo-paganism is kind of a red herring for us, because it's obvious for most neo-pagans. I mean, they have actual beliefs, they have actual feelings, they have actual aesthetic preferences, they have actual theological negative objections, but when it comes to positive theological statements, they don't actually believe. Whatever your positive worldview is, you have to be one of the people who actually believes and is seen to be sort of living that actual belief in your life in a real way. So thank you, Shipwreck by Plutonia. Maybe in the future, but right now, that talk kind of said my thoughts on that topic. And the issue is as for evaluating where the left is, we're not going to know where the left is until next summer. I think that the left is going to emerge into the summer of 2023 being sort of an incredibly tired and spent force. They're going to have absolutely no enthusiasm. And if the right wing can expand into that summer, not being optimistic, but being real and present and somewhat assured that, okay, we might have lost politically, but at least we still have our souls intact, I think that's going to be a good position for us to be in. But right now, I think, the left wing right now is still living in its own delusions. And I think they're not going to come to pass, largely because of these limitations on easy energy. Darth Kilhoun for $3 USA. Hi Dave, I'm writing the second draft of my series. It's set in a more traditional alternative world, a more traditionalist alternative world, and I have two micro-wars take place. In this particular book between Catholic Bavarians, one of two, and continued, he says, and American Mormons. But it would this be a countersignal to a technical political ally in our current struggle we are in? I rationalized in a non-ideological world these conflicts would happen again. Actually, it's funny you mentioned this, Darth Kilhoun, because I don't have enough time to write fiction, and I'm also really bad at it. I mean, I think that I could write passable fiction if I tried, but the problem is that whereas extemporaneous writing comes to me like this, as you can tell in this live stream, my thoughts about extemporaneous matters, my opinions on things, kind of compose themselves very quickly. I write 3 sentences of fiction and I have to rewrite and rewrite and rewrite. And speaking through characters is very difficult for me. I never really learned that very well in school, and I don't really have time to learn it right now. And maybe when I'm retired or something like that. But one of my frequent fantasies is I had this. When you say Catholic Bavarians, I had this semi-serious, semi-silly. It was supposed to be sort of a takeoff on a book called The Mouse That Roared, and the plot was that CERN, like they turn on their big hadron collider or wherever in Switzerland, and it explodes and creates this time bubble, and this time bubble it creates a copy. Like it creates a time-displaced copy, so there's no causality problems, that flies forward in time of this small area of Switzerland or of Bavaria or wherever, some place in the Alps. And what happens is you have this time-displaced brigadoon of 16th century Lutherans that have had 200 years to grow and advance in this time bubble, and they pop out in 21st century Europe. This little spot, and these people are hyper energized religious Lutherans that have they've gotten technology or something like that, and they just absolutely take over Europe in a matter of 20 years. Their birth rates are insane, and Europe is just tired and just completely folds. And that's been a fancy of mine as a short story. But I mean, I don't know. In fiction, I think the idea of a conflict between Mormons and Catholic Bavarians is pretty cool and based. And it reminds me of my own kooky short story ideas that I'll probably never publish. If someone else wants to steal that idea, you're welcome to it. I think it's better that ideas get out there. I don't know. Don't be worried about depicting a fictional battle and have that carry over. I mean, certainly, I love stories about the 30 Years' War and about conflicts between Catholics and Protestants. And does that make me want to go to war against my friend Turnip because he's a Lutheran and I'm a Catholic? Not at all, right? Fictional stories about conflict, if they're dealt with respect, I mean, if we're going to, do some kind of, while Mormons are subhuman heretics, then, maybe that causes some conflicts. But if that's just the backdrop to a human story, I don't think it actually creates a political conflict. But it sounds like a cool idea, Darth Calhoun. I hope you send me a copy when you're finally done. Dakar for $3 USA. You said pagans think Christians are exacerbating the erasure of ethnic cultures with Catholic charities, pro-refugee attitudes, etc., etc. Are pagans wrong? What is Christianity's limiting principle on helping the needy? When ethnic culture is at stake, I mean, it's pretty simple, guys. This is a manufactured conflict. Most Christians believe that you have a primary responsibility to defend your family and to defend your nation and those close to you. Before, marginal benefits to other nations. I mean, by all means, help other nations. But your primary responsibility is to those close to you. Christians have always embraced the idea of borders and nations and a special responsibility. That does not obliterate our charitable duties we have to faraway peoples, but charity to faraway peoples eclipsing our responsibility to those close to us is an invention of progressivism. And really sort of superimposing this upon classic Christian ethics, it's kind of a dishonest tactic. I mean, it's not a dishonest tactic if you bring the critique against people like, I don't know, like liberal Protestant mainliners and the leaders of a lot of contemporary churches who are trying to ship actual Christianity with progressivism, which is a poor match. But to say that this isn't something that is, so it's fine for that. And I personally, if you want to sell me paganism as a complaint about actual Christian leadership in the contemporary world, that's fine. But to superimpose this as a necessary element of Christian theology, it just doesn't pass the smell test. I'm sorry. There are too many contemporary Christian leaders that do not embrace the absolutely insane progressive view on immigration, and it's not even a humanitarian view, because these immigration policies don't benefit the countries that they're being used with. They don't benefit the migrants. They don't benefit the countries that these migrants are coming from. All they do is create economic and cultural chaos in the West and create sort of these weird subclasses and ethnic tensions that are going to devolve into violence eventually. So there's no humanitarian case for them. Modern Christian conservatives are against these policies. And not only are modern Christian Orthodox believers against these policies, almost all Christians from all previous ages before 1972 were against these insane policies. This is a phony conflict. There's no substance to this, right? It's just, okay, I hate David French. I hate David French, or I hate mainline liberal Protestant preachers who have rainbow flags in front of their churches. That is not a serious critique of Christianity. And I don't know what and the conflict is completely contrived because you're not talking to those leaders. You're co-belligerents against those leaders with other Christians. And also, you're not in possession of a real religion that could be an alternative to Christianity, very obviously so. And so what you have with this objection is it's a complaint, it's an emotional complaint I sympathize with, and in an emotional sense I take it very seriously. But it's not really a critique. There's no alternative to be embraced, nor is there a logical argument that conservative Orthodox Christians or right-wing Christians or real Christians need to take seriously, because for the most part those groups are opposed to the very policies that this argument presents as necessary to their own religion. So they're living counterexamples. So that's why I see that this argument just has no wheels. I mean, I sympathize. I sympathize with your emotional objections to people who are not me. I hope you find an alternative that's logical. Maybe if you could translate these emotional objections into a critique that applies to a religion that I or anyone else in our circles actually follows, we might have a conversation there. But as it stands, this is just a complaint about David French with a Viking hat on top of it. And, that those things don't add up to a position I have to actually perceive as serious. I appreciate the sentiment, though. Okay, but let's move on. Okay, so Novom for $10 USA. Any advice on moving across the country? Well, I have advice on that. I've done that, 5 times in my life? Or, well, not 5 times. Like 3 or 4, depending on what you, what side of the country you're moving across. Any advice on moving across the country in scale of time zone to time zone or more? In the scale of from time zone to time zone or more. Oh, okay, you mean you cross the time zone. Okay, I mean, I don't know. I'll say this. I've moved up and down the country many, many times. Mainly, usually it's from Seattle to California to back to Seattle to California to back to Seattle to California. Sometimes Portland. And I'll say this, that the difference in culture between different areas on the West Coast is very, very small. Whereas the cultural differences between the West Coast and the East Coast are small and are getting smaller, but they're still somewhat significant. People on the East Coast are gruffer. They're more matter of fact. The culture is a little bit deeper here. It feels a little bit more like Europe. And it also has a certain weight to it and a certain gravity to it that's missing on the West Coast. People on the West Coast are more irritating, where people on the East Coast are more oftentimes assholes. And there's a difference between being irritating and being an asshole. Or you could say that people from the West Coast are douchebags and people from the East Coast are assholes. That would be a good distinction if people understand the difference between a douchebag and an asshole. I don't know. I mean, I guess there's different ways to meet people. It's harder to meet people on the West Coast than it is on the East Coast, even though I come from the West Coast. It's time zones. They're easier to manage when you're on the East Coast because everyone's earlier on the West Coast. So when you call people at 9 o'clock, me being a night owl, they'll be more able to take your calls. I don't know. Without some more specifics, it's way harder to move with a kid than it is without one. Do your moving early, guys, because it gets harder and harder and harder as you put on more weight, so to speak, with your family attachments. But anyway, short question, so I'm going to have to move on. Thank you very much. Bartholomew the Red for $5 Canadian. Thanks for the fiddle advice several streams ago. I'm sounding better and better. You mentioned your wife was from Nova Scotia. I was also born there, and I live near New Brunswick. Thoughts on this part of Canada? Ever take a trip out this way? I don't think I ever have. That's so odd. I've been to Quebec many, many times, but I don't think I've ever been to Nova Scotia, or Newfoundland, or Prince Edward's Island, or New Brunswick. I just haven't been there. I'm sure my wife would love to go back. We'd have to find some money to go there, and I don't think maybe she still has relatives that live out there. I don't really know. There is a great form of fiddle music that comes from out that way called Cape Breton fiddle. And I never really mastered it, but it sounds great. And if you can be a fiddler that knows an obscure style of fiddle music, oftentimes you can be in a certain amount of demand because you have that style mastered. And so people are always looking for different styles of fiddle music to integrate into folk concerts. And someone asked me about how can we create music culture. When I lived in Portland and Seattle, a big thing was what were called house concerts, which were local townies with nice wooden homes would rent out their houses and charge like $5 cover fee to have aspiring young artists who were on the cusp of being professional, or sometimes even professional artists, come and sing mini concerts there, and get paid some amount of money for their efforts. And there'd be dinner. There'd be kind of like a potluck dinner, and those were so much fun. And I highly recommend, if we could create something like that, that would be an enormous thing to pull off. But I think we're so far away from that. But yeah, that's on my bucket list to go out there, and I hope that your fiddling continues and improves. But I'll go on to the next super chat. Stephen Townsend for $10 USA. Hi Dave, you mentioned in previous streams that the way to create an elite class is through the education and university system, and that universities shut out right-wing elite creation. Is there a way to create some kind of alt university system to create spaces to build right-wing elites? I think there is, in a sense. I think that altogether we are too schooled in the classic sense. I think that what we're going to see in the next 20 years is the mass deschooling of the American population, because education at the graduate level has ceased to fulfill any useful function for the economy. I think that the right wing is really ahead of the ball when it comes to a revolution that's going to happen in schooling, which is that we're going to move towards more individualized education approaches. In particular, we're going to move towards tutoring and homeschool co-ops and drilling, because we've known for ages what works for students when it comes to actually learning things. First of all, there's a certain amount of rote that needs to be drilled into kids' heads. And this can be done in a collective environment, and that's fine. And obviously when people got rid of memorization in school, and when they got rid of memorizations, and when they got rid of aptitude-based learning in schools, they did a death blow to the public school system in America. And I think largely this was phased in with a bunch of hippy-dippy ideas in the 60s. But in the 90s onwards, it kind of became part of this whole attempt to facilitate affirmative action and diverse advancement of students, because this is always a barrier to those efforts. Pardon me. But there's a certain amount of sort of grammar-based learning, attitude-based learning that needs to be reintegrated into schools. But beyond that, when it comes to further learning, tutoring needs to be something that's a supplement to all children's educations, and focused learning and individual projects need to be a part of individual children's vocations at younger and younger ages. And this is where I think homeschooling co-ops can sort of pull ahead of progressive establishments. They can sort of pull the trigger on this possibility before. I mean, they could just do this and just create better individuals and sort of dance on the grave of progressivism, so to speak. But that is the great hope, is that you can create an anti-university. Now, you can't just create an anti-university that looks like a university and charge people for it. That is totally inappropriate. That no one's ever going to do that. And moreover, the entire cathedral is going to descend upon you and try to blow you up the second that they see you market yourself as a university. As a matter of fact, they're so eager to blow people up for marketing phony universities that they a lot of the brain dead bread tubers from 2 years ago tried to get PragerU canceled for the ridiculous notion that it was posing as a real university. I don't know what people thought was going on. I think people were selling them enrollments or something like that, or whatever. Oh, what not? Who knows? But the left is very eager to destroy what looks like an alternative conservative university. And if you participate in the credentialing system of the university system, you're already playing their game inside their framing, which makes it sort of unfit for purpose. The evolution I see evolving is that we try to develop our own homeschooling co-ops and our own salons for adult people, and maybe something along the lines of the Chautauqua. People remember there was this independent educational movement in early 20th century America, late 19th century America, called the Chautauqua movement, where it was like lectures for adults to learn things that you would learn in college. And they'd have visiting scholars that would visit and give their lectures in these sort of Chautauqua events. There might need to be something like that we could invest in, where there would be in-person learning events that would be educational for people in a way that they just could not get this information from a YouTube video. Or maybe there would be a YouTube version of the lecture that you could watch and then come to this event, and there would be a lecture and a workshop based on that YouTube video. They would engage an adult audience in learning that couldn't possibly be done online, and then that might be better to be done in person. Copying these things might be a way for the right wing to get ahead of creating an alternative academy. Creating an alternative institution of learning and spirituality is just an indispensable part of this process. It just needs to happen. What Academic Agent is doing is a start. What Homeschooling Co-ops is doing is a start. What we're doing with the conferences, I disagree that they're futile. This is the start of something real. People need to build on these things, build on these skeletons, and take the next step forward. Now, the problem obviously is money. We need a funding source. And that has, in the past, been a huge barrier for the right wing. I think that we should, for what we can do, try to spend what money we can on developing these things, because they are the future of any kind of counter-progressive force that comes down the line. Okay, Zood for $3 USA. Thanks for all the streams, Dave. We love you. How do we discern the difference between effective containment from the regime and when we've won as dissidents? Well, I mean, the easy way, Yarvin had the best answer for this ever. Just ask yourself, does what happened make future victories more likely, easier, or does it make future victories harder? This is easy. Does the stuff with the Twitter files and Elon Musk's takeover of Twitter and his sacking of the Trust and Safety Councils, does this make future victories more possible or less possible? I think this is very, very obvious that it makes future victories more possible. So the Elon Musk stuff is an absolute win. His conflicts with the ADL are an absolute win. And like most wins, psychologically speaking, if you want to look at progressives get louder when they win, and they get quieter when they lose. Progressives cry out in victory. They sob in victory because whining is how they make their money. And crying is how they communicate their political prominence. So that's really what we're when progressives cry out in pain, you don't know that you've actually won a victory over them. But when they get really quiet and they slink away and they distance themselves from other people, that's when you know that they're actually worried about losing power, and you've come close to winning a victory. Containment is always hard. Is Ron DeSantis a containment candidate? Who knows? I mean, really, any Republican, like the entire Republican Party, is a containment party. So, no matter who wins the election or runs against Biden in 2024, they're going to be a containment candidate. Does that mean it's worse for them to win? I don't know. It depends what they do with it. the containment is always going to leak, and if it can leak in the right ways and in ways that lead to more productive avenues that make future victories more likely to happen, then that containment has been a stopgap for the cathedral and a meaningful step forward for us. If the containment just delivers entertainment to the people who want to grill and makes them feel like, oh, we've really shown the libs this time, and otherwise just means that the progressive cathedral can take a step forward and consolidate their control over the actual government and keep their own coalition intact, then it's a loss. It really is that simple. I mean, Machiavellian politics has many disadvantages, but when you think about things in terms of gaining or losing power, you can answer a lot of your factual questions about the universe, and for that reason, Machiavelli is useful even for Christians, even for people who have to reject Machiavellianism as a prescriptive philosophy. And that is what it is. Medwords for $5 USA. Hi Dave, just discussed de Beauvoir in my existential. I think Simone de Beauvoir in my existentialism class. It's rather amusing to see some of my peers go from balking at the utter nihilism of her direct intellectual predecessors to falling in line with every bit of second-wave academic feminism. Yeah, you have me at a disadvantage because I never read Simone de Beauvoir other than her interviews, which were very infamous, right? I understand that she was sort of like, Sartre's side cab, so to speak, intellectually and maybe romantically. So she was part of that whole scene. The problem is that, well, existentialism still has a little bit of its street cred intact, although I think it probably should have much less, given that I think that one of the great revelations, politically speaking, is that form does not precede essence. Essence precedes form. I'm sorry, existentialists. The ethos we take to the world around us characterizes our experiences of it and cannot be divorced from it. And therefore, trying to live your life as an existentialist character in a novel ends up being a futile endeavor that gives way to the very hysteria and anxiety existentialism is trying to guard against. So there's that core problem with existentialism, period. Just practically speaking, right? Obviously, you can, in the abstract, you can form precedes essence. If that's your axiom, I'm sure you can develop a worldview around it. But practically speaking, it does not work on any kind of scalable level. It does not create the people it claims it can create. It does not lead to emancipatory action. It leads to indulgence and indolence and an entire generation of people who are racked with self-doubt and anxiety. And so that's the problem with the sort of hard existentialism. Its marriage to second-wave feminism in the form of Simone de Beauvoir is particularly. I mean, I haven't read her, so, but the image of that is particularly cringe because it mixes two movements that at this point should have no credibility whatsoever. Second-wave feminism, the thing that eventually became girl boss feminism. Oh, wow, it's here for another round. Anyone else feeling like they should really lean into their careers? Anyone else feeling like we really should have women be men in the workplace? And what really matters for people's life satisfaction, but women in particular, is to have enough accolades, is to be the first woman this, to be the first female that, to have the right number of zeros behind your salary and then blow it all on temporary vacations and pedigree cat food. Anyone up for that again? Because that's where second-wave feminism leads you. That's where it all goes. And it goes nowhere. It goes into a giant void, like the rest of these existentialist ideas and this phony radicalism that isn't really radical. And what is really embarrassing about second-wave feminism is how in its final culmination it so deftly imitated the very image of what capitalism wanted to produce. It gave post-industrial capitalism exactly the slave they wanted to control, exactly the widget they wanted to put into their pod, exactly the kind of cog they wanted to fit into their factory. And because of that, her philosophy, even though I haven't read it, by the fruits, I know it, and by the fruits, it has shown itself to be a fraud. All right, guys, moving on. Paul A. Did the sexual revolution... Okay, so I'll have to click on this one twice because it's a question. Paul A. Did the sexual revolution have to happen in the order it did? Did we need to get the pill before we got to trans kids? Can we have gay marriage without no-fault divorce? I mean, that's a good question, Paul A. I can't imagine it happening in any different way. That's the problem, right? Women before the birth control pill tended to be conservative on social matters because they wanted to have men marry them. And after the birth control pill, women precipitously, I mean, I guess they were a little bit, women in the early 20th century were just definitively to the right of men. And then post-World War II, they became a little bit more left. And then after the birth control pill, and second, when feminism kicked in, they became precipitously, they became substantially more left-wing. I can't imagine. I mean, gay marriage without no-fault divorce would be insane. Because marriage would be sacramental, and it would be something that would be a bond that would be unbreakable. It could not possibly be... Gay marriage sold itself as a contract of pleasure between two adults. That's how gay marriage sold itself. Without no-fault divorce, that doesn't exist because marriage is seen as a covenant, as a vocation, as in some sense, and it sounds horribly unromantic, in some sense a burden. And without that, the logic of gay marriage does not work. And without the birth control pill, you can't get to autonomous gender or autonomous sex without autonomous sexuality. And you can't get to autonomous sexuality without getting autonomous sexual orientation. You can't get autonomous sexual orientation without autonomous sex, and you can't autonomous sexual acts or autonomous fornication, and you can't get fornication without the birth control pill. So I don't know, Paul A. Is it logically necessary? No. But I can't sociologically imagine the narrative that would bring about the sexual revolution in a different order than which it occurred. It extends from the emancipatory logic of birth control pill, of the birth control pills, and then it proceeds in a pattern that's an extension of that. Okay, but thank you very much, Paul A. I'm going to go on right now. Nervan V-Maker for $10. Western thought and literature. This is the question you asked me on Twitter. I appreciate you paying me money for this. I'll try to give a good answer. Western thought and literature warns people against radical breaks from tradition. But the tradition people are born with today is evil. You must radically break from it. But in doing so, will you not risk becoming a rebel for rebellion's sake? How does one rebel without becoming a spiritual rebel? An agent of chaos, as I like to say. That's an excellent question. This is a huge problem with Western literature. Is that the default assumptions behind Western literature are the existence of Christendom. And this is why our current age is going to reform a Christianity that's unlike anything we've seen in 1,000 years. Because now we have to have Christianity in total exile. I think there are some examples of Christianity in exile. The one that's coming to mind most prominently is John Bunyan's A Pilgrim's Progress, which was brilliantly sort of, I don't want to say retconned, but updated, given a sort of a patch by C.S. Lewis when he wrote the book A Pilgrim's Regress. So this is a style of writing that is incredibly unfashionable in the modern world. I mean, John Bunyan himself was sort of this yokel, I am told. I don't, I'm intimately aware of his biography, but he's sort of this Puritan yokel, and he writes this story about a man named Christian, who is, I forget what the city he's trying to escape from, like the city of vice, and he's trying to get to the city of God. And every person he encounters along the way is named for the very virtue or vice they literally represent. And so what you have is the story of a conversion that exists in archetype through the form of an adventure, but everything is just like on the nose, on the nose, on the nose, on the nose. And to modern ears, it's actually a good book, and even the Pilgrim's Regress is a good book, and I really appreciated it. I read it as a Christian, so maybe it would not hold up to people who are less in the faith. But to modern ears, this sort of on the nose allegory just clangs, right? Because we're so used to like this subtle like layering of symbolism. It's just like this person is this archetype, and he's literally doing this, and it's zero subtlety. But I appreciate that because it depicts the Christian as a rebel on a journey. And, I think that there's an element of this in sort of, obviously, when we talk about sort of Arthurian legend, we are talking about, Arthurian legend comes from Christendom, very early Christendom, right? So I don't have the dates off the top of my head, but these things are written down sometime around the Norman invasion, but they're obviously oral traditions that are brought about in the Dark Ages, and insofar as they represent an extant king, which was King Arthur, these things come from literally the Dark Ages. And I still think that the Arthurian legends have as a backdrop the assumption that the knights are operating in a world that is almost entirely pagan and hostile to Christianity. And what they're doing in their quests is sort of forging into this England that is just covered in iniquity and, covered in monsters, as they describe it in the actual legends. But these monsters represent sort of the untamed pagan gods or heretical gods that are wandering through the world today. And that is sort of the mode or the perspective that I see the outside world in currently. And obviously the big problem is that we can't write Pilgrim's Progress, guys. I mean, I'm sure try. I would love to read it personally. If you want to write a story about a modern person named Christian who's like literally fighting archetypical monsters in a realist setting with on the nose allegory, I will read it and I'll probably enjoy it for what it is. But what we need is what I kind of yearn for is sort of realist fiction that treats that can somehow discover the heroism of the small Christian community trying to eke its way and survive in the morass that is the modern world, modernity, with all its sort of iniquities and all its heretical disasters and all its insanity and all its massive mental health problems. One of the problems we have about being a thoroughly modern person is actually social media itself. It's very, very difficult to have a protagonist that is, most modern people engage in social media to a degree. And that means that you have to be a realist, you have to have a modern protagonist that is like blogging about themselves, even a little bit, like while the story is going on. And that's very difficult to capture narratively and still have a sense of imminence in the story. Okay, I'm going to go on. Thank you very much, Nervan V Maker. Ophelia Multimedia. Oh, well, I was just on your live stream the other day, I believe. I think you're posting it soon. Ophelia Multimedia for $5 USA. Thanks again, Dave, for being my first ever guest. For anyone interested, it premieres on YouTube at 6 p.m. PST on my channel, William Media. Pardon the shameless plug, great stream as usual. Well, I will certainly post it on my Twitter feed when I get a chance. And thanks for the super chat, man. I hope you have a great night. It was great talking to you. Ben White for $5 USA. Is the best way to resist progressive institutions to build local culture? Difficult. I'll talk more about that. What are some ways to do so? Maybe Tech Catechism or RCIA class. I've assisted in those before. Maybe teach a homeschool class on history or economics. Yeah, so local culture is, maybe you could do local culture. So all culture is based around groups of young people, mostly men, but a few women here and there, right? That's where cultural production comes from. It is a not tightly organized or tightly knit, because oftentimes these people hate each other or are rivals. But it comes from a group of young men who are interested in the same thing, being around each other and participating in the same cultural mode, the same reality, and reacting to the new reality they inhabit, and kind of bring that forward in cultural artifacts. And that can exist, I think, in a parish. The problem, obviously, is people moving around a lot, and that always tends to disrupt it. It's hard. Modernity makes this very, very difficult, because the only places this happens are in urban areas, and people move around those urban areas a lot. And, I've come and gone from a variety of Catholic communities, some stronger than others. And it's always very, very difficult to put down the necessary roots for community. And then on top of that community, to grow some group of young men and women who are younger than me, who want to take a shot at producing something new in the worldview that we come from and value. And you see little green shoots here and there, strong communities that are stable, it seems, that have kind of gotten past the crucible of modernity. But we've got a long way to go. I think, you can't really produce culture. You can only produce art and community and events and texts, and also families and religious worship. Don't exclude. Actually, that's probably in the reverse order of importance. I just said that list of things. But you can't create a culture. You have to create the substrate of a culture, and then have a culture emerge from that thing. And the more that thing is IRL, the more of a culture it will be. The more it's online, the more of a disembodied text it will be. And I realize the supreme irony of creating a disembodied text while answering that question. But, I do my part. I like to think. Like, I had an in real life friend on the other day, right? He's not someone I met online. He's somebody I know in real life, and a great guy. And, so maybe the barriers will start coming down. But real culture comes from real life, guys. That's the sad reality of it. As much as I appreciate your super chats right now. Thank you very much. Sam153 for $10 USA. Is the best way to resist progressive institutions to build local... Wait, didn't I just add that? Sam153. That's it when I need to double click here. Sam153 for $5 USA. Cheers, Dave. Advent blessings to you. Have you ever seen Glengarry Glen Ross? I recently saw it, and its commentary on desperate working men stuck with me. Any thoughts? Well, that's an interesting question, because someone asked me for my favorite gangster movie, and I couldn't think of it. I like gangster movies, but not particularly. But when someone asked me for my favorite crime movie, all I could think of was Mamet. I absolutely love David Mamet. He writes such compelling dialogue. I even saw one of his newer ones in the theaters when I think it was just premiering. I saw this in Seattle. It was called Race. It wasn't Mamet's best, but it was like the dialogue again, just spot on. I love Mamet. He wrote The Winslow Boy, was another really good one. The Spanish Prisoner. I think that's only a movie. And then obviously like Glengarry Glen Ross, which has just dialogue after dialogue that is so memorable. Everyone always remembers that one Alec Baldwin scene. Coffee is for closers. Coffee is for closers. You think I'm fucking with you? I am fucking with you. Yeah, everyone, always be closing, always be closing. That speech. Everyone knows it, everyone loves it, but the interactions with all of these small men, these incredibly small-souled men who are in this rat race for these small amounts of money, talking to, like, they're basically losers. I mean, maybe Alec Baldwin's character is the shit, but something in me tells me that his whole act with his Mercedes Benz and his watch that costs more than your car, something tells me it's all an act. And it's just these insecure men being these petty tyrants over this empire of dust, trying to sell worthless real estate to people who can't afford it, with the hopes that these suckers' checks are going to clear before the bank realizes that they're cashing money that doesn't exist, or before they realize that they've wiped out their own life savings. It's a great study on human nature and human evil, and yeah, it's a great movie. So thank you for that recommendation. Not for the faint of heart. If you want a movie where there's some people cannot watch movies if they hate everyone in them. Another similar movie that comes to my mind that's very similar to Glenn Ross is the Ryan Gosling movie Nightcrawler. I think it's Ryan Gosling. The Ryan Gosling movie Nightcrawler, where this utter sociopath of a person. And I think it's a great movie, but some people hate it because there's like no likable people in the movie. They're all these like soulless people. But it's a study in evil. It's like those medieval paintings of monsters and the likes. Okay, moving on here. Richard Wong for $5 Australian. Could you expand on your idea of a multi-ethnic right-wing community? As an Australian-born Chinese guy, both the modern urban Chinese and Western values seem empty to me. Furthermore, as much as I admire rural Aussies, I don't think I'll ever be one. Well, I mean, I say multiracial ethnic right-wing communities, but really it's a misnomer because any multi-ethnicity inside a right-wing community will be homogenized out in short order. So, I mean, a new ethnicity will form because there'll be no barriers to marriage, and that it will be kind of assimilated into the stronger culture. Religion is really the mode by which multi-ethnic communities become new ethnic communities in and of their own right, or by which I should say alien sounds like a harsh term, but people from outside the ethnicity are absorbed and integrated well and in a non-subversive way into the majority community. Marrying into a Christian community as somebody who comes from China or who is Chinese ethnically is much easier and much more easy to absorb and causes much less disruption than, say, for instance, somebody who is converting someone else's daughter to Taoism, right? I don't know how a community survives that, right? So, and the fact that it's right-wing Taoism is not going to make very much of a difference, because at the level of community, our whole concept of minimum viable religion or vitalism is absolutely useless. Minimum viable religion is an abstract concept that does not exist, and by the time it comes to building communities, it needs to be substantive. And for that reason, you need a religion. I hate to kind of give such a crude answer to this question, but right-wing multi-ethnic communities are religious communities, and they're also not going to be multi-ethnic for more than like 2 generations, right? What will happen is they will one dominant ethnicity will kind of assimilate the other ones, or they will merge together seamlessly and become kind of a composite community. In many ways, like you see in mestizo communities in Mexico and in many Latin American countries. I love it, hate it. Sorry guys, that's just how human communities work. And, I can't advise your particular situation, Richard Wong, but the fundamental principle for soullessness is find people who believe something. Usually it's going to be religious, and build your life around that. And that's going to involve a certain amount of conforming your own worldviews, or not conforming, but learning how to exist inside that community. And those communities will probably be right-wing because they actually believe. And right-wing communities, when we're all right-wing about the things that we care about. I found, I don't really know much about Chinese expat communities, but from the outside they look very, very mercenary and very deracinated. Now maybe there's an interior core that's thick, or maybe there are people enacting their own little Benedict options on the side in these Chinese communities. But from my own perspective, it's really the European communities where there's this or assimilated Asian communities that then break from the assimilation programming, like yourself or other people who find their way back to sort of, I am not Chinese, but I want to find some thick community that is not modern, Western, deracinated, soulless, a-religious modernity. I think there's opportunities sort of from disaffected Westerners or disaffected Asians that are second or third generation who are looking for something different. And but more or less what they're going to find is they're going to find their way back to some religion, and that religion is going to be more particular than just plain old vitalism or deism or minimum viable religion, right? It's going to be, and I can advise you on why I found this in Roman Catholicism. And even Roman Catholicism, I'm feeling, is too general. It needs to be more specific than that. It needs to be a particular variety of that. But I can guide you into the particulars. But unfortunately, the nature of the question doesn't give me enough to kind of go on to answer that question in particular. Marco Polio. Oh, I love that. It's a portmanteau of a Roman name, Pulo, and Marco Polo. Marco Polio for $5 USA. I think this is the last super chat of the night, guys. It's the last super chat. This is a nice compact stream this time. Maybe I'll end it at the 45 mark to make sure that it's nice and cohesive. Thanks for the late stream. Thanks for the last stream with Father David. How do you think about human biodiversity in a Christian context? I don't mind having different congregations for different groups, but I don't know of a right-wing way for those parishes to come together. Well, okay, first of all, like human biodiversity could be, by my rating, probably is, but we don't know, just reality. Tough. Christians do not divide the sacrament. We can be as biodiverse as you might imagine, but we don't divide the body of Christ by ethnicities. And, fine. If you want to have a church where people speak Vietnamese here, and a church where people speak Spanish here, and a church where people speak Chinese here, and people speak English or Gaelic there, that's fine. And, the chips fall where they may, so to speak, right? But the sacrament does not have boundaries to it. We don't police boundaries to sacraments. We don't police boundaries to marriage. That is for, if you want to make choices where you happen to be sharing the sacraments with people of your own ethnicity, I don't personally see anything wrong with that, but it is completely inappropriate for the vicar of Christ or for the church herself to orchestrate divisions of this kind in any capacity. The only thing that she can do is respect divisions that other people say that they want to have, right? That's the most that she can do, the church. So there's sort of a hard limit there. The sacraments cannot respect this, and insofar as sacramental vows cross these lines, so much the worse for these lines. If you married, if you went into this Christian sacrament of marriage with someone of another ethnicity, that marriage is still valid. Period. I don't care about whatever biodiversity. Who cares? For me, biodiversity is only an issue because we've enacted policies in terms of mass migration and in terms of racial equity, which are insane for reasons that have nothing to do with biodiversity. They would be insane even if there are no statistical differences whatsoever between ethnic groups, statistically. If we're completely homogenous groups that just happen to have different skin colors, these policies of mass migration and affirmative action would still be bad policies based on culture alone. The only thing I care about with human biodiversity is that the cathedral is lying about it, probably, and that its existence completely makes the application of these policies not only supremely bad policy, but capricious and destructive to the future of the body politics themselves. I really don't see why right-wingers need to interact with this. If this reality is a reality, right-wingers, okay, what do we need to do? Okay, we need to build our own communities. Fine, right? And if it's I imagine most communities are mostly one race. Okay, we're not going to break up families, obviously. We're not going to break up the sacraments. And so there's going to be some fuzzy boundaries, right? And then new ethnicities will form, as they always have, as they always will. New culture will form, as it always has and always will. And that's going to be kind of the long and the short of it. I mean, there's really what do I as a Christian need to say beyond that? All human races have equal dignity. To the degree to which they want to live close or far apart is really a prudential decision of the peoples themselves. And my prudential opinion on mass migration and forced integration is that it's bad policy that hurts all races involved and has for the last 50 years we've implemented it. And I think certain amount of integration is very, very good in certain prudential circumstances and should be pursued. But as sort of a blanket policy, as a Procrustean bed that we force people into, where people have to have certain quotas or levels of races, is just this extended insanity that we have no reason to believe should result in good outcomes. Not the least of which is what we're seeing from studies that I'm sure you're very well aware of. Read the Nicholas Wade's An Inconvenient Inheritance or anything else. This is, we see this on the horizon. It's an unfortunate reality that could be true, but it's a reality that has zero bearing on the Christian witness unless we propose to do something insane like I just was talking about, right? Okay. All right. I'm going to go on here and go to Darth Calhoun for $3 USA. Dave, when I finally get these books done and I begin publishing, if I send you copies, would you review them? I don't know. People have sent me copies to review. I can't review I don't have the time to review manuscripts. If you send me a 300-page book, I might be able to read it, time permitting. But I can't post revisions to you in a timely manner. I don't have the bandwidth, unfortunately. I can tell you whether I liked it or not in broad strokes, in the space of an email maybe. But I can't, review transcripts, unfortunately. I just don't have the time. I work a 10-hour-a-day job and I have a family, and I barely am able to fit in my blogging and my writing in my own capacity. So I do appreciate it, Darth Calhoun. But, I've heard that there are a number of people in my Telegram feed that actually do like reviewing things and revising things, and they don't want to be on the front. Have you tried looking into sort of the Telegram groups that we have surrounding places like Sildings? That might be a more productive place to look for this. Discord used to be the best place for this, but that's an option that's no longer open to us. But thank you for the super chat, guys. I think that's the end of the super chats. I'm very happy with this being a shorter stream since I already did a stream last night. And anyway, I will read tonight's psalm, which is Psalm 21. And then I will wish all of you guys a very happy night. Psalm 21. O Lord, your strength gives me joy to the King. How your saving help makes him glad. You have granted him his heart's desire. You have not refused the prayer of his lips. You came to meet him with the blessings of success. You have set on his head a crown of pure gold. He asked you for his life, and this you have given, days that will last from age to age. Your saving help has given him glory. You have laid upon him majesty and splendor. You have granted your blessings to him forever. You have made him rejoice with the joy of your presence. The king has put his trust in the Lord. Through the mercy of the Most High he shall stand firm. His hand will seek and find all his foes. His right hand find those who hate him. You will burn them like the blazing furnace on the day when you appear, and the Lord shall destroy them in his anger. Fire swallowing them up. You will wipe out their race from the earth, and their children from the sons of men. Though they plan evil against you, though they plot, they shall not prevail, for you will force them to retreat. At them you will aim with your bow. O Lord, arise in your strength. We shall sing and praise your power. Amen. With that, everyone, thank you for joining me for this very impromptu and unstructured Ask Me Anything for Advent season. Everyone have a very happy St. Nicholas Day and a wonderful, well, I guess we're on our third week of Advent right now. Have a wonderful Advent season, and I'll be back with a much more focused live stream next Tuesday. Have a wonderful evening. Good night.